Amen. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he is dealing with questions concerning marriage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, concerning the responsibility of a husband and wife in marriage. And remember, we talked about last week the context of the present distress, dealing with the problems that were happening because of living the Christian life in that society. That has to always be understood when looking at some certain passages, because that explains why he said certain things, especially verse 1. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. And so you compare that to what was said in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 2, where God said it's not good for man to be alone. Well, that's not a contradiction when you understand the context of the persecution. Under a severe situation, it's better not to marry, but if you have to marry, go ahead and marry, is basically what he's saying. But it's in certain situations, it's not always smart to marry because of the stress of a certain situation. And in verse 10 he says, "Now to the married I the Lord I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife." We talked about that last week, how that was the teaching of Christ that you find in the gospel accounts, where Jesus on earth made those statements that he only gave one exception, and that is fornication for divorce. That the innocent spouse can divorce the guilty spouse because of unfaithfulness sexually, and that innocent spouse can remarry. But the general rule is that husbands and wife are to stay together. I came across a very good article written by Bill Burke concerning divorce, and it's titled "Before You Divorce." And it's very good concerning people who are thinking about divorcing. I don't want to read all of it to you, but I want to read 3 things because I think it's very interesting. Number 1, divorce does not solve all the problems. People who have the attitude, "I'm going to get rid of my spouse and I will rid myself of this problem and I'll be happy," that's not always the case. In fact, one study suggested that 60% of second marriages end in divorce. 60%. It doesn't have to, but that's the statistics. And number 2, divorce often creates more problems, especially if the divorce is contrary to Matthew 19:9. If it's in harmony with Matthew 19:9, it's still rough, but of course it's according to God's will. But if it's out of harmony with Matthew 19:9, then of course it's a sin and a violation of God's will. It says the standard of living for a divorced woman has been known to plummet at an average of 73%. And also, a number of divorcees report that they continue to experience hurt even after 10 years after the marriage is broken up. It leaves emotional scars. And number 3, divorce hurts children. Even in a scriptural divorce, it hurts children. Even in a scriptural divorce, it affects adult children of the parents. And you see why, as you look at these things, why it says in Malachi that God hates divorce. He grants it for one reason, but God hates divorce. He gives a quotation here from a woman who wrote a book, "A Hole in My Heart, Adult Children of Divorce Speak Out." Here's what it said. "The most striking impression one comes away with is that for children, the divorce of the parents never goes away. It may be welcome, it may be understood, but even when it is a positive solution to a destructive family situation, divorce is a critical experience for its children. Although there may be relief that a painful situation has been ended, there is also regret that a healthy family could not be created." And that's just the destructive nature of it. And so a person needs to weigh those things very seriously in the light of the situation. The best case scenario is that a wife can forgive a husband that's cheated if the husband's willing to repent and come out of it, or vice versa, and heal that marriage. That has happened. It's not always the case. But these things need to be weighed very, very carefully. Look at verse 12, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 12. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say. And this means this is further revelation that Jesus did not address while he was on earth. I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. A woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, for God has called us to peace. Verse 16, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save the husband, or how will you know, O husband, whether you will save the wife? Now, he's giving further information. Here's what you would have. You would have a situation where the gospel is preached in Corinth. A husband and wife both hear the gospel. The wife obeys and the husband doesn't. The wife becomes a Christian, the husband doesn't. So the question that was written to Paul, verse 1, one of the questions is, what do we do now? Is this a legitimate marriage? Should I leave the unbeliever and go find a believing wife? The answer is no. If that believing husband can dwell together with the unbelieving wife, or vice versa, it's still a marriage in the sight of God. It's still a marriage. We have to understand that marriage predates Christianity. It goes all the way back to creation. That's what Jesus did in Matthew chapter 19. He went all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. And marriage is for the whole human race, for those who are eligible to be married. And so here you have the situation where the question's asked, one spouse is converted, the other is not. The answer that Paul gives is that they're not to divorce. You stay together. And he says in verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. That word sanctified there is used in the sense of saying the marriage is sanctified. It's a holy marriage. Even though the husband may not be converted, may not ever be converted. It's still a holy marriage. It's still a marriage that's recognized in the eyes of God, even though it is mixed in the sense of you having a Christian and a non-Christian together in that situation. So it's still a legitimate marriage is what he's saying. He says, otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. What do you say about a woman who has children out of wedlock? What's the word that's usually used? Starts with an I. I think it's I. Illegitimate is usually the word that's used. Now the children are legitimate children. But the concept is that there used to be, not so much now, because our country and culture is changing, but it used to be years ago, if a woman had a child out of wedlock, it was a stigma. It was a bad thing in society. And the children were called illegitimate. Not that the children are guilty of anything, they're innocent. But they're not born in the covenant of marriage. And so he's saying, if your marriage is not legitimate just because it's a Christian and a non-Christian married together, he said your children would be considered unclean, but they are holy. That unclean means, and it would be equivalent to what we would say as being illegitimate children, or children born out of wedlock. It is an actual, genuine marriage, and the children are from a legitimate covenant of a husband and wife, even though one spouse is a Christian and the other spouse is not. So he's making it very clear that people of the world, two unbelievers, can be married in the sight of God. An unbeliever and a believer can be married in the sight of God. And also two believers can be married in the sight of God. Marriage is an institution that is regulated by the New Testament, but did not originate in the New Testament. And there's a difference. You see, the Catholic Church has placed upon society the concept of the Catholic Church determines who's married and who's not. Their priests tell who's married and who's not. Well, that's not true, because marriage is legitimate whether a person is even a believer in God or not. Two people can be unbelievers totally and be married in the eyes of God, because marriage is an institution that God ordained, not the Catholic Church and not the New Testament. It was a long time before the New Testament that marriage came into existence. Now he says in verse 15, here's a situation where the unbeliever departs. What's going to happen then? The unbelieving spouse leaves. What is the situation then? This husband says to the wife, I can't live with you because you're a Christian. You're going to go down there to that Church of Christ, give my money away to them? I can't live with you. I'm leaving. Or vice versa. But usually it's the male in a situation like that. What's the situation? But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. That verse there has been twisted to say that Paul here is giving another reason why you can divorce. But that would contradict Christ. Christ only gave one reason. And Paul, the ambassador of the king, is not going to give an additional reason that would contradict his king. The word bondage there is a word that's used to describe being a slave to someone. And what he is saying here, he's saying, Christian husband, Christian wife, you are not to be a slave to your unbelieving spouse to leave Christ and say, okay, honey, I'm going to give up Christianity and I'm going to remain with you. If you'll stay, I'll give up the Christian faith. Paul say, no. If they want to leave, let them leave. Now, what's the principle? You got to keep it in context there. Verse 11. But even if she or he depart, let he or she remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. There's the principle. So if someone says, I can't live with you, you're this Christian, I'm not into that, that's not my thing, I'm going to leave, Paul says, let them depart. You don't give up the faith to be enslaved to them. Your first loyalty is to Christ. Let that unbeliever depart. Now, if that unbeliever departs and goes out and commits fornication, then that spouse has a right to divorce and remarry. But if they just depart, that's not another reason to divorce and remarry. And people who have tried to make it say that, tried to twist this to accommodate people who are divorcing for other reasons than what Jesus gave in Matthew 19 and verse 9. Any questions or comments about that before we look at verse 15 or 16? When you look at verse 16, he's saying this. Wife, you could convert your husband. Husband, you could convert that wife. So you don't divorce them and leave them. If the husband and wife, a believer and an unbeliever, can coexist peacefully, he says, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? And there could be husbands and wives here in this very assembly who have been converted as a result of their spouse. And we rejoice when that happens. Peter talked about that. Look at 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. The Apostle Peter talked about this. Here's the situation where the wife is a Christian, the husband is not. In principle, it would apply in reverse, but in this case, it's talking about the wives. Does she have a responsibility to that unbelieving husband? Look at verse 1, 1 Peter 3 and verse 1. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. So this could apply to someone who's not even a Christian, or it could apply to a husband who was once faithful, has become unfaithful as a Christian. They're no longer obedient to the Word. And Peter says to them, you submit to them anyway. That means you don't do anything that violates the will of God, but you submit to them. You still have the responsibility of a wife to that husband. He says in verse 2, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear, they see how you're conducting yourself. You, without a word, could convert that husband. He says in verse 3, do not let your adornment be merely the outward arranging of the hair, the wearing of gold, or putting on a fine apparel. In other words, don't focus on the outward, external. Verse 4, rather let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner in former times the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Verse 7, he talks to the husbands. Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. So we find it there that the Apostle Peter is in complete harmony with the Apostle Paul. Of course, they have the same source, the Holy Spirit, guiding them in what they are writing. And that goes along with 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 16. You could convert that wife. Or wife, you could convert that husband. And you don't even have to say a word. You just keep on living that Christian life. You just keep on living it. They see your conduct. They see your persistence. They see your willingness to keep on keeping on. I heard a story of a man that was very hostile towards the Lord's church. He hated the Church of Christ. His wife was a Christian, and he would do everything he could to keep her from going to church service. He would be abusive to her verbally. If she would go, he would take the keys from her so she would have to walk. And she had children, I think, the story goes. But you know, she kept on. She kept on. You know, finally that man was eventually converted. Not only converted, later on, years later, he became an elder in the Lord's church. You know why? She kept on. No matter what was going on, she kept on. She was going to be dedicated and devoted no matter what he did. And that finally won him over. He got to looking at it and said, there must be something to this. Sure enough, he was converted to Christ. It can happen. But even if it does not happen, even if the spouse is never converted, which is a very sad situation, each person is going to be judged individually. I'm going to be judged individually before God, whether Jennifer is faithful or not. The same way with her. She's going to be judged individually before God, whether I'm faithful or not. I think some Christian couples think that they're going to be judged side by side standing before God. And that's not how it works. I will be judged on how I conducted myself as a husband, but I'm going to be by myself standing there in judgment before God. That's why it's very sad to me to see if one spouse becomes unfaithful, the other one will become unfaithful too. Some Christian husbands are not faithful if their wives become unfaithful, or vice versa. And that's a sad situation. And you wonder where their priorities are when that happens. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17. Paul says, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk or conduct his life. So I ordain in all the churches. Whatever way that you have been called, that's the way you conduct yourself. Now these verses are very much perverted, and I'll show you why in just a moment. Verse 18. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not become circumcised. Verse 19, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you were made free, rather use it. Verse 22. For he who has called you in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freeman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. Verse 23. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Remember, he said that in 1 Corinthians 6:20. You were bought at a price. The blood of Christ. Don't be enslaved to men. Verse 24. Brethren, let each one remain in his and with God in the state in which he was called. Verses 17 through 24 have been perverted. Let me show you how they've been perverted. If you've been called as an adulterer, remain in that calling wherewith you were called. If your marriage was adultery, you remain in that marriage. And so you go ahead and you're baptized, and all of a sudden that marriage isn't adultery anymore. Now there's many problems with that. The one main problem is, are any of the items that Paul uses here sinful activities? Is he using any example of a sinful activity that you're to remain in? No. He's talking about whether if you're a Jewish person and you've been called by the gospel, you don't have to become un-Jewish to be a Christian. If you were un-Jewish, you were a Gentile, uncircumcised, when you were called to be a Christian, you don't have to become Jewish. You remain who you are. He says that a circumcision, that doesn't matter. You keep the commandments of God. That's what matters. If you were called as a slave, don't try to get out of that situation. You take that opportunity as a slave and live the Christian life. And if you were called as a free person, you realize that you are Christ's slave. You have a master. You are bought at a price. Don't become the slaves of men. You remain in whatever calling that God has called you. In other words, we go over to a foreign country, we go over to Jamaica, we go over to Africa, and we preach to them. Those people that we preach to don't have to become Americans. They have to become Christians. They're still Jamaicans. They're still Tanzanians. They're still Russians wherever you go. From India. They're still who they are, but they become Christians now. So they remain in the condition that they are in, and they don't change who they are except the fact that now they are Christians. So these verses is in no way can be used to justify an unscriptural marriage. Because an unscriptural marriage is a sinful condition. I mean, could we put homosexuality in there? If you were called as a homosexual, remain in that calling. You were called as a fornicator, remain in that calling. You were called as an idolater, remain in that calling. No, that's ridiculous. Then why would we think adultery would be an exception? And that's what the brethren have done. They have made adultery an exception. And that's because 50% of all marriages end in divorce, and most of those are not for scriptural reasons. And so these liberal brethren are accommodating society instead of teaching the truth. Because if they taught the truth, their numbers would drop, their money would drop, their popularity would drop, and therefore they would be in trouble. They would lose their jobs, things like that. But verses 17 through 24 is dealing with whatever situation. And he's going to go on to talk about if you were called in a single condition, then you remain single. But you can marry if you want to. Later on, he's going to talk about if you were called in a married situation, and that marriage is legitimate in the eyes of God, you stay in that condition. Whatever situation that you're called in, you remain. Notice verse 19. He says, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. You know what some would call Paul for saying that? A legalist. Paul, you're a legalist. You know what the definition of a legalist is? A definition of a legalist is someone who strictly adheres to the commandments. Someone who is trying to follow exactly the commandments. That's the basic definition of a legalist. And so liberal brethren call those of us who are trying to do what Paul said in verse 19, oh, you're legalist. I really don't have a problem if they want to call me that. Now, if they mean by that I'm trying to earn salvation or score enough points to get to heaven, that's impossible. The Bible teaches you can't do that. Even at your very best, Jesus said, we are unprofitable servants. We're only doing that which is our duty to do. However, Paul oftentimes talked about keeping the commandments. Paul would have to be labeled a legalist by these liberal brethren. Because faith working through love, Galatians 5 and verse 6, is what pleases God. And Paul, the same author, says here, keeping the commandments of God is what matters to God. So if someone wants to call me a legalist for that, and I've been called a legalist, I've been called a Pharisee. If someone wants to call me that, that's fine. I have no problem with that label. I don't call myself that. I call myself a Christian, follower of Christ. But if you want to call me a legalist, first of all, I want to know what you mean by that. And if you mean by that someone who believes in strictly following the commandments of Christ, hey, that's the worst thing you could say about me? I guess that's okay. It's a compliment. I have no problem if they want to call us legalists. It's a compliment. Yes, we're trying to strictly adhere to the commandments of God. You know, when Jesus condemned the Pharisees, He did not condemn them for being strict, obedient people to the Word of God. He condemned them for neglecting certain things. For neglecting mercy and love and things like that. That's what He condemned them for. And also adding to the laws of God, the man-made traditions. That's what He condemned the Pharisees for. Exactly. So, if we make it very clear that it is wrong to worship God with instrumental music, it's not just an opinion. It is wrong. It is a sin, a violation of God's will. Oh, you're legalist. No, we're just doing what matters to God, and that's keeping His commandments. And He said to sing, and I have no right to alter that or add to that. So, if someone wants to label me a legalist, I have no problem with that if they define it for me. Usually people don't know what the definition of that is, because I've asked them, what does that mean? They can't define it. They've heard other people say it, but they can't give a definition of that. So the point of verses 17 through 24 is basically this: you remain in the condition that you are. If you're called as a single person, don't hurry up and get married now because you're a Christian. Or if you're called as a married person, you don't get out of that marriage. You stay where you are. Verse 25. Now concerning virgins, it's very interesting as he talks about virgins. Those who are unmarried are considered virgins. That's both male and female. That's God's will. That the male and female remain virgins until marriage. Then they have that gift of sexuality that they share with one another. That's God's will. So, in God's way of looking at things, there's virgins and then there's the married. And in our society, something like that is utterly ridiculous. But it's God's will. Now, concerning virgins, he says, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one whom the Lord has mercy and has made trustworthy. Verse 26, I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Now, what he's doing now, he's giving inspired advice because of their situation. That has to be understood. He's giving inspired advice because of their present distress. Verse 26, it's not really smart to get married because of the trouble that's going on. Verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. If you're loosed from a wife, do not seek a wife. Verse 28, but even if you do marry, you have not sinned. So he's saying if you need to marry, go ahead and marry. You've not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. I was talking to a young person the other day that was wanting to go to school. He's in about 19 years old. He's wanting to go to school. He wants to do some great things with his life. But he's so madly in love with this girl that he kind of wants to put those things on hold and go ahead and get married. And I told him that's not the smartest course. That's not the smartest course. Now, if he ignored that advice and went ahead and get married, did he sin? No. But that's not the smartest course right now for his life. If he would wait, things would be better. And that's exactly what Paul is saying here. If you marry, you have not sinned. If your virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you that. You know, it's hard enough to be married. Then to compound it by getting married in a stressful situation. That's basically what he's saying. Verse 29. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, talking about the stressful times that are happening because of persecution, verse 31, and those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. Verse 32, but I want you to be without care, and he who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, and that he may please the Lord. In other words, in this situation here, if you're single, it's the very best, because if you go ahead and get married, not only are you concerned about yourself, but now you're concerned about your wife. And if the government is wanting to kill you because you're a Christian, then you're not only worried about yourself now, you're worried about your wife. That's the context of what he's talking about. He goes on to say in verse 33, but he who is married cares about the things of this world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. In other words, if you remain single in this troublesome times, you are just concerned about yourself. But again, if you get married, you're now concerned about yourself and your husband. Verse 35. And this I say for your own profit, not that I might put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. There's the context of that often quoted verse. Serve the Lord without distraction. He says, I don't want to put any leash on you and tell you it's wrong to marry, but it may not be the smartest thing to do right now. And when we serve the Lord, we want to serve Him completely without distraction. And if a person marries someone that's going to distract them from serving the Lord, it's best not to marry. The person needs to consider all the evidences and all the situations and then marry at the proper time. You know, Solomon said, I think it's Ecclesiastes chapter 2, there's a time for every purpose under heaven. There's a time for everything. Everything has a proper place. And sometimes it's not the smartest thing to do as far as marriage is concerned. But that can happen later on. But he says, if you marry, you have not sinned. He's giving inspired advice here. He's not telling them not to marry. He's telling them concerning their situation, it's good to stay the way you are, that we might serve the Lord without distraction. Verse 36, but if any man thinks he is becoming improper towards his virgin, if she is past the flower of her youth, and thus it must be, let him do as he wishes. He has not sinned, let them marry. In other words, if you have someone and you feel like that you're going to behave improperly towards that person, I think that would include fornication, premarital sexual activity before marriage. Paul is saying, go ahead and marry. You have not sinned in that situation. Verse 37, nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, so does well. In other words, you have self-control. Verse 38, So then he who gives her in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage does better. Again, because of the situation going on. Verse 39, a wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Only in the Lord. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Verse 40. But if she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. Again, he's saying here concerning those who marry, concerning the situation, the context of their persecution, it's best to wait to marry. But if you go ahead and marry, you have not sinned. Now, look at verse 39. It's the principle of being married for life. As long as you both shall live is the covenant that's made, that's broken about 50% of the time. As long as you both shall live. A wife and a husband are bound by law together as long as he or she lives. But if that husband or wife dies, he or she is at liberty to marry to whom she wishes. Only in the Lord. Now that only in the Lord has caused some trouble for people. Does that only in the Lord refer to only a Christian? That would be the normal use of that word, or that phrase, in the Lord, referring to a Christian. That's the normal use of that phrase. Only in the Lord there, referring to the widow or the widower remarrying, sometimes has been interpreted this way to say you marry in the will of God. In other words, if you are a widow or a widower, you don't marry someone that's been divorced unscripturally. You don't have a right to marry someone that's been divorced not according to God's will. It has to be in the Lord or in the Lord's will that you marry. And some have made the argument that Paul said, if you want to turn to Ephesians chapter 6, they've made this argument here concerning in the Lord. Ephesians 6 verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Does that mean that children whose parents aren't Christians, they don't have to obey? No. They say that in the Lord means in the Lord's will, you obey your parents. Whether they're Christian or not is irrelevant. But you marry or you obey your parents in the Lord. This is the Lord's will. They could both be atheists, but you still obey your parents in the Lord. That's the Lord's will. But here's the problem with this. In Ephesians 6 and verse 1, children have no choice who their parents are. They have no choice who their parents are. A person who marries has a choice in whom they're going to marry. They have a choice. So it is generally believed that this married in the Lord, and you have good brethren on both sides of the issue, it is generally believed, and I've read and studied this, that only in the Lord means just what it means on the surface there. You marry a Christian. Only in the Lord. Because you can choose your spouse. You can't choose your parents, but you can choose your spouse. Yes. 2 Corinthians 14. 6:14. Right, this is used to show the danger of marrying someone who's not a Christian. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Or what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? And he goes on to talk about come out from among them and be separate, be my people, be pure, be holy. I believe that's a principle that could be looked at as far as someone who's going to marry, because you're yoked together in marriage. Why would a Christian want to yoke together with someone who's not even a Christian? That's something to surely put into consideration there. You know, in verse 39, when you look at that, I always operate when I deal with verses that are a little bit difficult. I operate on this type of rule of thumb. It's better to be safe than sorry. That's how I operate. So if I am a widower and it says only in the Lord, I'm only going to marry in the Lord. That is a Christian. I know that is the safest, the best, and the most pleasing thing in the sight of God. I can't guarantee that with anything else. But I can guarantee that if I marry in the Lord, if I marry a Christian as a widower, that is the thing that would be pleasing in the eyes of God. So that's how I operate. Better to be safe than sorry. I'd hate to marry outside the Lord, thinking that verse means, well, just marry someone that's not been divorced unscripturally, and come to find out on Judgment Day that it meant pretty much what it said on the surface. I'd hate to be in that condition. So, only in the Lord, many good brethren have discussed that. As I've said before, the weight of the evidence to me is that's referring to a Christian. Because you can choose your spouse. You can't choose who you're born to. Look definitely before you leap. And so, when we finish this chapter, and we're going to end right here, it gives us a serious look at what marriage is. God takes marriage so very, very serious. The world does not. That's why you could end it just like that. There's a lot of people going to be called into judgment. A lot of preachers and elders are going to be called into judgment for accommodating the world instead of preaching and teaching and practicing the truth. We've got to do what's right. Yes?
Verse 39. A lot is bound by law as long as your husband lives. Is it talking about God's law or law of the land? Either or both?
Verse 39, bound by law as long as her husband lives. I think it's referring to God's law, the law of marriage. That they are bound to one another as long as they live. But when one of the spouses died, then they're free to remarry. The living spouse is free to remarry because marriage is only for this life. Marriage will not extend into the afterlife. So that's what I believe it's referring to. For a cross-reference on that, we won't read this, but Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 3 will be a cross-reference on that. Thank you very much.